Hi, I'm Courtney Berger, Executive Editor at Duke University Press, and it's my pleasure today with Cait McKinney, Assistant Professor in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University and author of Information Activism, A Queer History of Lesbian Media Activism. Welcome, Cait.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I guess my first question for you is, what is information activism? And what prompted you to write about it?
So with that term, I'm talking about the ways that sexual minorities build information infrastructures for their movements. And what that means is resources like bibliographies, newsletters, archives to keep their records. And I'm really interested in the ways that sexual minorities create and circulate information when they don't otherwise have reliable and consistent access to that information through mainstream sources. So think, for example, of a lesbian in the early 1980s who's just coming out and wants to find resources, goes to the local library in her town, is afraid to ask the librarian for help, doesn't know where to find things in the stacks. Maybe lesbian materials aren't there to begin with. So how do social movements, how do lesbian feminist movements respond to that lack as organized movement work? What they do is they do information activism. They create their own resources that are community specific, that are meaningful to people, that share the information people need to find each other, to organize, and also to make life more livable within conditions of homophobia and misogyny that are everyday and institutionalized. So that example of a person coming out, she might go to the library, but she also might call resources created by information activists like telephone hotlines. I look in the book at lesbian feminist telephone hotlines that were organized by volunteers to answer the phone from callers in need who were looking for maybe crisis counseling, but also looking for just basic information about where to find a roommate, what bars to go to, where to find a lesbian-friendly plumber, for example. These are information resources that are really, really key when you're living life on the margins. And in terms of how I was prompted to write about information activism, when I started this book, it started as my dissertation. And I thought I was going to write a dissertation about how community archives and queer community archives in the present were taking up digital technologies. This was in around 2013 when I started the research. And I started doing that work at a community archives called the Lesbian Her Story Archives, which is in Brooklyn. It's a very grassroots archive and a very well-known community archive. And I was doing work there, interviewing people, doing research in their records. And I realized that the story that I wanted to tell about how lesbian organizations and lesbian activists work with digital technologies was much longer. There was this really rich history of activism with information and with media technologies. So I just realized I couldn't tell the history of how an archive digitizes its records, like how it scans photographs and puts them online, without also telling the story about how that same movement created print newsletters in the 1970s to do what was really at its heart the same thing, which was to put that kind of rarefied information about lesbian life out into the world so that people who needed it could find it.
Yeah. So you describe the work of information activism and the lesbian feminist movement as the unspectacular labor of social movements. Can you say a little bit? I mean, you've started to talk about this a little bit, but about why this labor is so important?
Yeah, I love that question because it's, in some ways, this book is the least sexy sexuality studies book of all time, because it's about things like telephone hotlines, right? It's not about...
Telephones are very sexy.
Well, I think so, but I'm a nerd, right? I mean, we're the wrong people to ask maybe about what's sexy and what isn't. But when you call a telephone hotline, you're not, or when you tell the story about calling a telephone hotline, you're not telling the story about like what happens when you actually find community. You're telling the story about like what are the technical details around how people come to that community. So it is unspectacular, but it's so, so important. And for me, it's like part of a broader shift in the field to how we tell movement histories. So trying to start to tell movement histories that aren't organized around spectacular events, that aren't organized around famous protests, that aren't organized around huge conflicts or blow-ups at conferences. Those are important histories to tell, but I think also part of what the field is doing and has been doing for quite a long time is moving towards these more nitty-gritty, everyday kinds of stories about movement work. And that can help, that can help to attune us to more modest ways of understanding activism and how it works in an everyday kind of way.
So what do we learn by thinking about the history of information, or in this case, information activism, as a queer history?
Yeah, I mean, the subtitle of the book identifies the book as a queer history of lesbian media technologies. And that was important to me to signal a method, right? So queer is a kind of methodology. Queer is a way of looking sideways, looking from different premises about who counts as an actor, who counts as an activist, and looking at different values around data. So I'm looking at folks like, for example, there's a story in the book about this longtime volunteer at the Lesbian Her Story Archives who was responsible for creating catalog records on the computer about every VHS tape in the organization's collection. And she did this work, nights and weekends for years and years and years and years. And 10 years later, when the archives goes to transition its catalog to a different computer database, they find that a lot of that data is inconsistent, right? It has to be cleaned up in the terms of contemporary data hygiene in order to be able to speak to other databases like WorldCat or Google Scholar. But the archives keeps all of the records of that woman's work, all of those old records, in addition to doing that data cleanup. And that's a queer method of attuning to forms of description over time, like the everyday choices this volunteer made about how to describe another person in a video she was watching, how to describe an identity that's changing and in flux over time. The things we call ourselves in social movements change over time. Who we imagine as belonging to a social movement changes over time. And that can become a problem of description. We need to adapt the terms we use. So the archives keeps all of these records when maybe a more mainstream institution might just throw them away, right? And that's a really important record of media history and of emerging feminist data politics around the time when computers are being widely taken up in those contexts in the 1980s.
That seems so important because it's, you're really pointing to the way in which pieces of information aren't static or don't hold the same meaning over time. And the methodology you're kind of pointing to is one that allows for that, to attend to those changes.
Yeah, and it's key, right? Like KJ Rawson and Kristen Williams, who are two trans studies scholars I really respect, have done similar kind of histories of description around trans cataloging. And that kind of nitty-gritty work with how data has been created can show us a whole epistemology around the ways that communities make meaning about themselves and create shared terms. And it really matters for understanding how movement values and concepts of identity change over time.
So one of the things I really love about your book is how much attention you give to the political importance of these relatively ordinary technologies, which you talked about a little bit in the beginning: telephones, filing systems, notebooks, Rolodexes. Like you, I geek out on this stuff. So I love the texture that you give to all that. But you also do end up tracing the shift from these analog technologies to digital ones. How does the adoption of digital technologies, how has that affected information activism?
Oh, I mean, one of the things that surprised me the most in the early stages of this research is that for a lot of these organizations and these women, the shifts to digital technologies, it's not a rupture. They're just new options, like other tools that they've adopted in the past. So in many ways, they're applying the same sort of questions around accessibility, like Will our volunteers be able to use this? Privacy. Will this keep our records safe? Will it keep our records within community? And so part of what the work does is, I think, trace a more modest story about what it means to take up digital technologies, right? And to provide a model for showing how the way we talk about technological transition can come from understanding broader movement values about information, about technology, about access and control. And we can look instead of looking at the digital or turns to the web as this kind of like radical new moment in the history of activism, we can think about how those practices took up and adapted pre-existing practices. An example I look at in the book is this organization called the Circle of Lesbian Indexers. And they worked with print technologies in the 1980s. They worked with index cards. And what they were trying to do was to create basically like a searchable database of all of the content from lesbian feminist newsletters that had been published in the 70s and 80s. So kind of like quick access print guide that people could use to find information on whatever topic was of importance to them. Like, let's say, lesbian motherhood, or there's even a subject heading for lesbians and canoeing, right? Like whatever it was that you cared about, you were fired up about, you could use this guide to find that information. And this organization tried to take up a computer database program. And so in their records, in their archives, there's all this correspondence and conversation about finding the right program and how frustrating computing was and trying and kind of failing at it. And in that chapter, what I want to do is like tell a more modest story about early adopters and early adoption, and talk about an organization that ended up actually turning away from computing in the 80s because it wasn't quite right for them. It wasn't accessible enough. And I think that those stories are part of telling a queer history of computing and of media technologies, right? Is tuning the research we do to that kind of register.
So to follow up, you do describe what you call an attitude of capable amateurism among the lesbian feminist activists as they tackled new computer database technologies in the 1980s, but like with any of the technologies that they were taking up, as you've described it. Is this an attitude that you think still serves social movements and queer movements today?
Yeah, capable amateurism is a term I develop in the book, and I think people either love it or hate it. And I think the resistance to it is the term amateur can sometimes have a negative connotation. But I'm really trying to separate the term amateur from any kind of negative connotation. What I mean when I say the term capable amateur is, I mean, these women might not be experts with new computer databases in the 80s, for example, but they have so much capacity for tinkering with technologies, for being willing to be frustrated and bored while they figure things out and learn things, to be willing to ask for help. And so it's this like amateurism that is based in a tremendous capability that's like so much greater than expertise or professional training. So for me, it's a really empowering term for describing the work activists do to learn and take up technologies. And the other part of your question is this term still important for us today, or how can we think about it today? And I think it's a key term because it shows us how important it is to think about the ways that regular people work on and with information technologies and develop systems that support their communities within conditions that aren't of their own making. So when we look at the work that capable amateurs do, we're showing reverence and respect for and centering our work around that kind of grassroots work, like figuring things out, right? Like thinking about the ways that, for example, in our present moment, like youth culture has developed TikTok into its own particular kind of like world and medium. We can critique the ownership structures of platforms like TikTok. We can critique the fears around surveillance and those platforms, but we can also look to the ways that this is like a tremendous example of grassroots capacity building with information technology.
Right. It seems like the concept also, right, allows more people to have agency, right, within a social movement if you can be an amateur and still take up these technologies for political ends.
Yeah, it's like recognizing everyday labor, recognizing all kinds of people as actors in their communities and in their movements. And for me, the term reflects like the ethics that my narrators explain to me about the work they do, right? Like lesbian feminism and lesbian feminist organizations are fundamentally committed to, like, if you show up and you want to be part of our organization, you want to work with us, like, we're going to find a way to bring you into it. With exceptions, of course. There's all kinds of stories of the ways that lesbian feminism has been unhomely for many people, right? Trans exclusion within lesbian feminist histories, white supremacy within the ways that lesbian feminist organizations formed or are remembered. And those are important stories I tell in the book as well.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of in this conversation, but throughout the book, you do come back to these questions about access and exclusion kind of throughout, both within these organizations and the type of work they were doing, as well as your own scholarly practices and how they're informed by those questions. Can you say a little bit more about the politics of access in queer activist movements and information activism?
Yeah, I mean, lesbian feminist history is full of like conflict and acrimony, right? And part of what we deal with when we tell those histories is like, what do we do with those painful histories in the present, right? Like what, because they're still acting on the present today. And that's why it's important to understand them and to continue to research them. So there's a few instances of conflict and access that I look at in the book. So the first would be the ways that anti-racism was leveraged as an information practice in lesbian feminist movements. So I look at the ways that white lesbians and Black lesbians worked together to create information infrastructures that meaningfully centered Black lesbians in the history of lesbian feminism and meaningfully centered their information needs. And one of the projects I look at most closely is Black Lesbians in Annotated Bibliography, which was a project by J.R. Roberts with a foreword by Barbara Smith that tried to, again, provide this kind of like search query function in contemporary terms around finding resources by and about Black lesbians. So this is like an example of the way that lesbians organized across difference, that people like Audre Lorde and Hazel Carby, or more recently scholars like Sarah Ellen Strongman have talked about, right? The importance of working across difference, racial difference in lesbian feminist movements. I'm looking at that as a question of like, how does that take shape on the ground as information work, as that kind of like unsexy behind the scenes work with media technologies. And then in the book, I also take up the question of trans exclusion and trans inclusion in lesbian feminist movements. So lesbian feminism is often and rightly so remembered as trans exclusive in the 1970s and 80s and into the present, frankly. And this is, particularly the case around trans women and trans misogyny. And what I do in the book is I try to tell a less spectacular history of how that happens. So how does trans exclusion or inclusion happen at the level of decisions to make service provisions around information? So what happens when a trans woman calls a lesbian feminist telephone hotline, right? And I look specifically at the policies of particular organizations, the women who worked there and how they chose to answer the phone, right? To tell a more complex story about those kind of everyday negotiations about who belongs in a movement. And those are really painful histories. They're hard to look at. They can be violent. And the reason we need to look at those histories is because there's like still profound work to do in queer spaces and in queer women's spaces today, right? Around trans inclusion. There's a tremendous amount of work to do. And so we need these examples from the past in order to, understand how those histories act in the present and to understand how to do the work differently.
Are there groups that you think are doing that work in helpful ways right now?
One of the organizations I look at really closely in the book is the Lesbian Her Story Archives. And I think that work they're doing around trans inclusion is really interesting because trans women have always been welcome at that archives, and trans men and trans people, but in a way that's never until recently been kind of laid out at the level of policy. And now they're doing the work of enshrining that into their policy documents. And that actually was a transition that occurred over the years of me writing this book. So something I was really kind of in dialogue with them about, and they would send me their new policy documents. And an organization like that is an organization that has volunteers who are, in their late teens and early 20s, all the way into their 70s. So this is like a tremendous intergenerational moment of capacity building and of organizing around what it means to work together across difference and what it means when a social movement's terms need to change. Like, what does that actually look like on the ground? So I really admire the way that organization has been, taking up these changes in an active way.
In the chapter about the call center, but also in some of what you're describing here, you do talk a little bit about the affective labor of doing this work as well. So I'm just curious if, how you would describe that relationship between the affective labor of this and that kind of information part of it.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it's a book about affect, right? Because it's a book about often how activists learning new technologies deal with experiences like frustration or boredom or alienation, right? So how do you push through those feelings? Because what's at the end of that experience of like struggling with a computer database alone at night and on the weekends, was at the end of that experience is a system that's going to like really meaningfully serve your movement in a new way. So I look at how activists write and talk about being bored. And I look at that as a really key modality for understanding who is invited to find things like computing fun, right? And who is not invited into using those tools, for whom they're not made accessible, right? But these women like find ways to use them anyway. They push through it. And that's a process of affective management almost in a way that's like made possible for them by this bigger vision of what might be achieved, right? So you can like do data entry for hours and hours and hours on end because the data you're entering is this like really fiery, important movement information that's going to make life more livable for the community that you care about.
So interesting. So my last question for you is less about the book and more about writing the book. I'm interested in this as your editor. This is your first book, right? So what did you learn about the writing process as you were working on this book? And I'm wondering if there's any advice you might share with other folks about how to approach the first book.
Oh, writing is such a heavy question. I feel like it's something we talk about so much in academia, but also like we keep it so secret also. It's like so personal and specific to like what your life looks like. I think for me, some things that helped were talking to you, like talking to an acquisitions editor early in the process. I think the first time we met, I had probably just defended my dissertation. And I think I was a bit along in the process because I had been thinking about it as a book for a while, and I had a committee that allowed me to do that. But it was just so helpful you cued me to thinking about like, how does this matter to the field? And how do I write the book for a reader who's bigger than my dissertation committee, that like kind of niche reader? So sharing it with an editor early or when you're ready to, but like more generally sharing your work early and often with people who you trust and care about. Like so many hands and eyes have touched this manuscript and has changed so much for the better. because of the generosity of friends and colleagues and being willing to read it and be honest with me about what was working and what wasn't. And I think the last thing is, I would say, is the labor situation in the job market right now is so hard and it's so different for everyone. And I wrote this book while bouncing between postdocs. And then I finished it in my first faculty position, which was a teaching intensive position. So this advice would look different for everyone in practical terms, but I really had to carve out time. And that was easy for me because I don't have things like child caring responsibilities. But it was still hard a lot of the time. But it was just about making myself do it even for an hour a day and finding amazing colleagues at my job at the time at Cal State Northridge who wanted to be doing that work for an hour a day too. And doing it together and holding each other accountable. So it kind of takes a community in a way to raise a book, I think. And that also makes it more joyful too.
Yeah, no, I agree about the community. I mean, it's important, and particularly feeling like you can share your work. I think when you have a supportive community where you feel like you can share works in progress and get useful, thoughtful feedback, it makes you more ready to share the work with bigger and bigger audiences.
Yeah. It's a tremendously vulnerable process. And you're right, like practicing helps. But it's always like a mentor and a colleague at my last job, who I won't name in case it would embarrass her, always said, like, you have to be willing to let go of your ugly baby. She called the manuscript as your ugly baby in a way, like no matter how beautiful it is, you're always going to feel a bit, resistant to let it out in the world, right? Because it's never going to feel perfect to you. But there's kind of something profound in that willingness to trust the people around you to read it and be honest with you and help you make it better.
Yeah, I mean, that's true both in the process of writing and getting the feedback, but even with a finished book. I mean, it's if you never let it go, then you never get feedback, and then you never get to have a conversation about.
Yeah, and maybe write another book one day, hopefully, right? And use what I learned from this process in the doing of that. So
is there anything else you want to share about the book?
I have some teaching materials on my website for anyone who's interested in teaching the book. They're aimed at the undergrad level. And I don't know, I'm just really excited to see what people think about it and to have conversations about it and, to see it trickle out into the field. It's really exciting. And I'm very grateful to you and the team at Duke for what has been a tremendously positive experience all the way through.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited for the book to be out in the world too. So, okay, with that, I guess we'll wrap up and send everybody off to buy the book so they can read it.
Thank you.
Thank you.